Mike, the best laid plans of mice and mayors have a way of turning into crap. How are you today, Mike?
You mean mice and rats?
Mice, rats, mayors, all that stuff.
Rats,
I
rats. Yeah.
people might be missing our initial start here because they could be overlooking at another stream that I was going to do about Mayor de Blasio's press conference this morning. It's going to play into some of what you and I are going to talk about when we start the sponsor exclusive segment on Patreon and Subscribestar. This week, people might not know this, but you've added Subscribestar now. So people who want to sponsor True Pundit
Yeah.
can choose between Patreon or Subscribestar. And, Mike, a lot of people have told me they've had a little bit of a kind of an easier time with Subscribestar, kind of an easier interface. If they're not as computer literate, Subscribestar is a good way to go. But they're going to get access to all the same stuff, whether they choose to sponsor True Pundit or Crowdsource the Truth. I certainly hope that people will sponsor both. That is to say, whether they choose to sponsor True Pundit on Subscribestar or Patreon, they're going to get the same True Pundit experience. And if they choose to sponsor Crowdsource the Truth, it's going to be the same experience on both platforms as well. There are a number of unique benefits to people who choose to sponsor True Pundit. You have started what has become an extremely popular podcast, the Thomas Paine podcast, and usually on Wednesdays is your kind of the big show for the Thomas Paine podcast. But people who sponsor True Pundit on Patreon or Subscribestar get access to the video version of Pain in the Morning. It's a commercial-free environment when they get it on Patreon and Subscribestar, and people can get your daily updates, Mike. There's a hell of a lot going on right now. Can you bring us up to speed as far as what's the latest news on TruePundit.com?
Well, we have a lot of stuff we're teeing up for tomorrow. And we're going to be breaking some news tonight on Patreon and on Subscribestar on our shows when we move over there at 8:30. We'll be breaking some news on there. Very interesting stuff. I had a good conversation with two Irish troublemakers, John Moynihan and Larry Doyle.
Oh,
And yeah, the guys who testified in front of Congress, about the
yeah.
Clinton Foundation. I had a good interview with them, and being that we all have a background as Irish troublemakers, we we get along very well. And they might have said some things they shouldn't have said, but that's called journalism. And once you say it, I'm running it. I told them,
It's been said. Yeah.
don't mess up on here. There are no mulligans, so to speak. So no, some really crazy stuff about this quote unquote pandemic. I'm calling it now the scamdemic. So we're going to touch on that tonight. Some of the things we talked about. I mean, it's really just disturbing. It'll be a national story tomorrow. I guarantee that. But you get it here first. Yeah, I can tell right away when something is a big story, obviously, and when it's not. I have a knack for that. You should know what the hell a big story is after all the time I've put into this racket. But so that's going on. There's some other kind of minor breaking news that we'll probably get into as well, depending on how. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. There's a lot of things going on. So,
Yeah.
our
But
major
just to
stories.
quickly, let's bring
Yeah.
people back up to speed on what Doyle and Moynihan are up to. These are the two private investigators who testified before Mark Meadows' oversight of nonprofit organizations committee. They've got tons of evidence and have worked with and been helped by and helped Charles Ortel. So people who have followed Sunday with Charles are going to know the line these guys are going down. That's exciting news that you've got an exclusive interview with them on the podcast tomorrow.
I don't think anybody else has talked to them. So that's good. They're very discerning on who they're dealing with. And my history with Mr. Moynihan stretches back to the Drug Enforcement Administration. So we'll just keep it at that. But so I've known of him, and we've been to weddings together and stuff like that. of different agents and some agents that were in my wedding, and I was in their wedding. So this is like a tight knit family. But you never knew at the time that we would be. I mean, he was in DEA and I was in journalism, right, doing all this stuff, and then I went into Intel. You never really knew at the time that I'd be going back into journalism and he would be doing this, chasing the
Right.
Clintons and Bill Gates and stuff. It's really kind of crazy that we are coming back around. It's really, I guess, we've talked about it with other people, and even with Larry Doyle, who's really heavyweight on Wall Street and really knows his numbers and is just a real heavyweight numbers guy and finance guy. And those two are a really tough combination. I would not want them tracking me for anything, believe me. And they get into a lot of the stuff they couldn't say at the hearing, because obviously you're restricted on what you can say. And with a dummy like Mark Meadows running the hearing, he's not going to get too deep in. I told him during the interview, I said, you embarrassed Meadows so bad he had to leave Congress. They really did a number on him. I mean, and Meadows is like, I'm out of here. I'm going to go work in the White House. But
well, he had already planned to leave Congress, didn't he? When that
I don't think so.
I think he did.
Maybe. I don't know. I don't keep
but
up with these guys.
They did, totally not take any crap from him. He wanted their evidence and stuff like that. They basically
they're
told
like, take
him,
a hike, pal. Beat
yeah.
it. And that's what I like about these guys. They don't play games, and they know what they're doing, and they have their ducks in a row. They're just a wealth of information, and I think they plug their Twitter on the podcast and stuff. And it's just an interesting conversation. I said, we'll chat for 45 minutes. I don't know what it went. You know how these things go. You start talking, it goes on. I don't know how long it was for, maybe close to an hour and a half, 2 hours.
Wow.
But just so much dirt. It's just insane. I'd say it's probably one of the better interviews I've had in a long time. And I feel like I've had some good ones. He had a good Navy SEAL last week, Jason Redman. And it's just good to be able to, on Patreon, even like when we talk for an hour and a half, 2 hours, an hour, whatever it is, it's just good to be able to say things that you can't really say on Twitter, especially now. Yeah, especially now, it's really getting crazy. I pulled back a little bit from Twitter because I'm thinking it's only a matter of time before they put the wood to me. I'm telling congressmen, like, you're a piece of shit. Go get, you're a poser, you're a fraud.
These are just facts.
Like, okay. Well, yeah, I try to stick to the facts, but when you're talking to the GOP and calling them that too, starts to create problems, little bits of waves, But and Twitter, by the way, I can't be the only one that sees this, right? It's literally, I can't 10 minutes on there and I feel like tackling a street sign. Go out in the street or drop kicking a hedge or a shrub or something. It's
literally
so
like going out on the streets of New York City right now. You're basically guaranteed to get into an argument. Yeah,
I've called it the social media street riot. It's the equivalent of what's going on now without the threat of the immediate threat. Now, we've had people stalk me. I'm gonna find you, man.
Yeah.
Figure out where you live. It's like, what? Is that what it's come down to now? If you have an argument with somebody, you stalk them and you try to hurt them. It's people can have differences. It's one of the things that drives me crazy. Dealing with advertisers on the podcast, saying, who are you? I listen to the podcast, and they're very concerned about all these things, about their brands and things, and the brands the brands they represent. I can't figure out who you are. One moment you're saying something that's from a conservative mindset, and the next minute you sound like a middle of the road Democrat. I said,
what?
What's the difference? Well, I said, if it's a common sense issue and it's anti-corruption, can't we agree that we all have common ground and there's middle ground? If we don't want to see our government,
that's racist. You said common ground. What did you mean by that?
I have to laugh. I think my brother's watching tonight. And
Oh,
the way we grew up, it's insane to even like if anybody ever called us racist, we just have to laugh in their face, like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? When you grow
yeah.
up in these neighborhoods, there's no race in these neighborhoods. I mean, I'd say there's some race when you first move in. There might be some race until people get to know who you are and stuff. Then you're just a dude, or you're just a girl. It's like I don't see things through racial. Like I said this a million times. We're all poor. There's no need to be in some kind of a racial divide, white and black. It's like
But I'm glad
shit.
you're bringing this up, Mike,
We're all
because
screwed. We're all screwed in
right,
here. It really is like that. It really is. I mean,
there is
I
no
know it might be.
racism in the shared poverty of government
There's none.
subsidized housing.
There's not. I don't think there is. If there is, it's not with kids growing up. Maybe there's older things going on. I don't know, but I mean,
Well,
I've had.
here's the thing that I thought of, Mike.
I mean, just real quick, I've gone into to black kids we hung out with, and the mom's like, "Yo, Mike, we want something to eat." Blah blah blah. They give you a sandwich. They put something together. It's not like there's none of these overtones of racism in the hood. It doesn't happen. It's not there to me, at least. When I was growing up, it wasn't like that. Everybody was in the same shit soup,
Yeah.
and you try to make the best of it. And
What do you think racism is, Mike? What does racism mean to you? What is racism?
it's just so empty. The whole word is just so played and
But
so
isn't it
empty to me.
judging somebody without knowing them strictly on their race?
It's a tricky question. What's the difference? What's the difference between Catholics and Jews and all these little things that you can use against somebody in an argument or in some kind of ideological debate?
Well,
Because they are different than you. You can make an argument out of anything. You can make an argument out of race. You can make an argument out of socioeconomic. You're rich, I'm poor. Screw you. You're black, I'm white. Screw you. Life is, you've had more opportunities than I've had. Screw you. That kind of thing. But these are all stereotypes. I
you're right.
think racism is so played out, and it's the funny thing about the whole thing of what's going on now is one of the most important things nobody talks about is all this stuff people are saying. We need this in the black community. We need this in the black community, right? To me, there's no difference in the poor community that also is the white community, because there's more white folks in poverty than there are African Americans. Okay, so when they say black community, they're really talking about the poor community that includes mixed race, right? Whites, Hispanics, and African Americans. Okay, but these are not people from the community saying this. These are
Right.
people talking down to these communities.
Yeah.
These people never,
Politicians and actors and stuff.
because if they were from the community and they were genuine, they would say, "Hey, wait a minute, I got a lot of white friends here who are poor too. Like what's good for this community is good for this community, regardless of race." And here's the thing: the people who are preaching about what these communities need are not from those communities, and they're not down with what those people need. And they don't ask those people what they want. They tell them what they want. They tell them what they need. And it's not representative of what they actually need. It's not. They never really consider they never talk to the street level leaders in these communities and say, "What do you guys need?" They just assume what they need. They assume that there's racial strife in these neighborhoods when there's not always, okay? And they assume by using a lot of stereotypes, like you said, how do you define racism, right? They're making assumptions, and then they're trying to formulate policy. And a lot of this is like a get-rich scheme for these leaders, so-called leaders of these blocks, whoever they are, of these different groups. Everybody has a group now, or some kind of foundation or whatever. They get more money, but that money never makes it down to the street. It doesn't. So where does all the money go? That's what I always say. I want to see where this money goes. These millions of dollars people are handing out, corporations, and billions of dollars. I think back to when we were kids. Do we actually think we would see any of that in the street? Will we actually think we would see like some community center built? No, it doesn't happen.
Even if you did, is that what you need? I mean, you've constantly said, kind of jokingly, but also not, you need shoes, there's so much that these communities need. And why is it being taken away from the police department? That makes no sense. There's tons of waste, there's tons of graft. I think everybody benefits from the police, whether you're poor, rich, or otherwise. The thing I was getting at is there's a huge movement, even before this George Floyd murder took place. There are a lot of people who have said to me, black people who have said to me, that it is just impossible for a black person to be racist. And I couldn't quite understand the point of view behind that, because as I understand racism, it is the judgment of someone based on their race without actually knowing them. So when someone sees someone who is white and says, oh, you have white privilege, I feel like that's a racist comment unless they know you and they know your background. This came up in my conversation this morning with former NYPD Commissioner Bernard Carrick. You've shared with us that you grew up in a financially kind of tough spot. Commissioner Carrick did as well. His mother was murdered. They lived in such a rough neighborhood. And I asked him the simple question if he could describe to us what his white privilege was like. And this is what I was kind of working towards with you, which is that I agree. I don't think this is necessarily a white-black issue, but all of this stoking of racial tension is making it an issue.
You have to understand something too. I've said this recently. It comes down to what's going on in your house. It has nothing to do with race. It's like, if you're from a single parent family, does your mom, is she on your tail? Does she care if you're getting into trouble and things like that? All this stuff starts at home. And sometimes it's hard for working parents to give a shit. But I've said this before, because they're so exhausted, right? They're so exhausted, and there's so many, depending on how many kids they have, there's so many different burdens that fall on them because of the kids. But we were always more concerned of what our moms would do to us, or be beyond the police. Like, and the cops knew this, right? The detectives, when we were growing up, we knew all the detectives' names. They roll in, hey, what are you doing? What are you guys up to? Hey, were you guys here 2 nights ago? It seems like some of you guys would have been doing. Don't do that. And then they pull you aside and say, hey, you keep it up, I'm going to have a conversation with your mama. And you'd be like, listen, we don't need to do that. We don't. What restitution can we make, officer or detective, right? We didn't want these guys going to our moms, because we feared our moms, what our moms would do, much more than the police or some court system, right? So a lot of this starts at home. And I think a lot of these kids we're seeing down the street, they're not even from tough socioeconomic.
Right. A lot of them are driving Mercedes, handing out the bricks.
These are kids that are lost. Their parents have lost these kids. They've done them a disservice and injustice along the way. And they're not necessarily a representative of what is going on in poor neighborhoods, although it's depicted that way by the media. It's a very tricky situation.
Yeah.
And
we're just about to transition over, Mike. I don't want to get you on too much of a roll, because we're going to really get into the conversation when we get to the sponsor exclusive segment on Patreon and Subscribestar. I mean, the reason I bring this up is because I feel like there's a strong possibility that the killing of George Floyd was not racially motivated, and so many people have been worked into such a fervor over it that even saying that incites just incredible anger. I'm sure you were aware of this, Mike, but back in January, $900,000, almost $1 million in counterfeit money was seized at the border in Minnesota. So we know that George Floyd was accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill at Cup Foods. We know that George Floyd and Derek Chauvin worked together at Nuevo Rodeo Restaurant and Club. We know that place burned down, and we know that the police precinct burned down along with all of its evidence. We know that there's a guy who's alleged to be a cop who was seen bashing windows and potentially burning places down. I mean, again, from the very beginning, my thoughts have gone to, are these guys involved in some criminal enterprise together that motivated Chauvin to kill George Floyd? Because it just doesn't make sense to me. Even if he is a racist, psychopathic murderer, why would he do that on camera. When someone's a psychopath, they're usually very calculating and cunning, and they wouldn't do something that would end their spree of psychopathy in the way that getting caught and going to jail would. So I think there's so much more to this George Floyd murder that hasn't yet been explored, and it's led us right to this most absurd campaign. I mean, this is literally the most absurd campaign I'm aware of in my entire life, this concept of defunding the police. So we'll talk about that in depth, Mike, in about 10 minutes when we get started on patreon.com/truepundit, subscribestar.com/truepundit, and of course the simulcast on Subscribestar and Patreon for Crowdsource the Truth. I'll see you over there, Mike, and we'll get into all of this, okay?
Good stuff, man. Thanks.
All right, thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you on Patreon and Subscribestar.